Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Ramblings of an Old Fart podcast. Hello, my name is Craig Warren. I'm 71 years old, been married almost 53 years, father of 9 and grandpa to a bunch. I'm sort of retired. I retired at 65 to provide full-time care for my wife who's had some serious health issues. But lately I realized I needed something to do to keep my mind active. So why not a podcast? I have a lot of experience. I've done a lot of different things in my 50-plus years in the workforce. I definitely have a lot of opinions, so what more would I need? I should mention that I have never been a member of a political party. I do not intend to do so. My podcasts do not come from a political place, just a factual and common sense place. In today's America, states seem to want the federal benefits. Comes from the federal government, but they don't want the oversight. They seem not to acknowledge federal jurisdiction. Also, states are not closely bound in a common cause anymore, it seems like. They're polarized by politics or by socialist views or any number of things. The citizens no longer seem to share a common ideology or purpose. We used to be united in a national identity or a common purpose or some kind of ideology. But I see all that falling apart in today's world. We used to call ourselves Americans. Now it seems more like 350 to 400 million people who just live in America. I'm a big fan of a country rock band called Blackberry Smoke, if you've heard of them. If you haven't, you might want to check them out. But the lyrics to one of their songs is called There Ain't Much Left of Me. And the chorus strikes a real chord with me when I'm thinking about the topic of this podcast. Let me read that to you. It says, I've been rained on, rode hard, and put up wet. Danced with the devil till I'm in debt. Took all I got, and there ain't much left of me. I've been knocked down, drug out, and left for dead. Barely held together by a few old threads. And I'm still here. There ain't much left to see. Yeah, I'm still holding on, but there ain't much left of me. And that's kind of the way I see our country in today's world. It's like we've just kind of beat it up lately, and there's just not a whole lot left. If we're not careful, there won't be anything left at all. If you've listened to my podcast very much, you'll know that I really like history. I like history and like following the money when it's appropriate. Today I want to look back through a little bit of history and draw some information and context from that history. So let's look at some historical examples of what I see happening in America today. One is probably a historical reference that gets overlooked a lot. This is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the late 17th century and 18th century. What happened there, one of the things that it all came undone is because they came up with what they call the Liberum Veto. This was some kind of law or legislature. It said any single member of the nobility could legally stop any piece of legislation. Wow, that sounds a lot like our judges in today's world, right? We've talked about this on other podcasts if you know it. We have all these district court judges all over the country. It seems like they can override anybody else and everybody else. But here's what happened to this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Because the regions or factions, it's funny how they referred to them as factions back then, and today we refer to them as parties. Political parties. But anyway, they couldn't agree on a common purpose. The central government became paralyzed. The Associated States became so polarized and weak that neighboring powers eventually just carved the country up. Serves as a warning to us of what happens when local or factional interests permanently outweigh the national interest. So you say, what's the big deal? How does that relate to us? Well, if you were looking at a map in the late 17th century or the early 18th century, you would see where Eastern Europe is right now. You would see this huge big old block that was carved out as one country. But today, if you look at that same map, you're going to see Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Latvia. And then there's some other fringe territories, Estonia, western parts of Russia, Moldova and Romania, and Slovakia. That's what happened. That's what's left from this once great, one of the most powerful countries in all of Europe. That's what I'm talking about. And I think that's where we are in the U.S. today. I mean, recently when we had all this stuff going on in Minnesota, we had the governor of Minnesota was ready to start a civil war. We had other states that were willing to band together with them. That's my point. That's where we are. One other one I found, a historical reference, is not in a foreign country. It's actually right here on our American soil. We've actually been here before. Right at the very beginning, just before the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation. They created exactly what I describe here as this firm league of friendship, or this barely held together kind of a thing. The states wanted the benefits of security from a federal government, but they refused to give the federal government any real jurisdiction, like the power to tax or to regulate commerce or any of those things. History suggests that this barely held together mentality, like I mentioned, is the natural state of large republics, unless there's a massive external threat or a very strong shared economic engine. Without those, they refer to it as a centrifugal force. The local politics tend to pull the edges away from the center. Everything's kind of pushed. And I understand that makes sense, but we have to realize where we are. Sociologists refer to this as atomization. My point about this 350 or 400 million individuals versus one America, that identifies what sociologists call social atomization. In the mid-20th century, the common cause thing, right, was often defined by world wars or the Cold War, or there was some other clear danger or a threat. Without a singular external pressure, the internal differences, the socialist views, the constitutional organizations, urban versus rural, all of these things become the primary focus. We stop looking outward and start looking at each other as the other, right? We don't have a common enemy. We find somebody here at home that can be considered the enemy, like the opposite political party maybe. Okay. The states want the benefits, right, but not the oversight. That's the classic principal-agent problem that the sociologists have identified. States have become so subsidized that, there's a huge portion of the state's budget comes from federal grants for highways, health care, or education, jobs. We have military there. We have government agencies stationed there. It brings money into their economies. But as the federal government attaches more strings or oversight to that money, the states rebel and keep their local voter base, to keep the local voter base happy, apparently, or some other reason. But they're creating a legal and jurisdictional tug-of-war thing, like we see at the border and the healthcare, or we see in immigration. When I talk about oversight, I don't know a lot of people look at that as a bad thing, but does anybody knows how much fraud is going on recently? Apparently there wasn't very much oversight going on in the states. So I'm thinking little federal oversight would have been a good thing. Most historians and political scientists point to a specific inflection point when these things kind of started happening. It didn't happen, first in the late 1940s on up through the early 70s. But there was a certain point when things started to change. Starting in the mid-70s, the parties began to sort people out, right? They stopped being big tent where everybody was welcome. They started becoming distinct ideological brands. This was the beginning of the end for the common purpose that we had enjoyed previously in America, a good share of our history. Once the parties became ideologically pure, if you will, compromise started to look like treason to the base. If you don't agree with us, you're out, right? Okay, so then we have this advent of this constitutional hardball, if you will. Many point to the early 1990s as the movement when the national identity was explicitly traded for partisan identity. Politics shifted from being about governance, and how do we fix the roads and all these other things, the existential warfare and other things like that. It became then not an outward thing, but an internal thing. The other side is the threat to the country now. How many times have you heard that recently? They are a threat to our democracy. Well, this is when the culture war starts, right? Language became the primary way we talk to each other, right? It moved from the halls of D.C. into other things to our living rooms now. We became polarized, even in our own daily lives and within families even at times. This is a concept popularized by journalist Bill Bishop. He argued that in the early 2000s, Americans have become physically and digitally migrated into landslide communities. We don't just agree with our neighbors. We choose to live only near people who think like us. I haven't seen that in my area, but I suppose in some places it is. With the rise of the internet and targeted media in the mid-2000s, we stopped having a common set of facts. Right? We have liberal media, we have conservative media, we have... you would think facts are facts, but apparently not. So this basically created the 350 million islands, or 350, 400 million I was talking about. We no longer share the same town square, even if we live in the same county. Recent studies, like those from University of Cambridge, suggest that 2008 was a massive mechanical turning point. The financial crisis broke the trust in systemic integrity. When people feel the system is rigged or failing, they stop identifying with the nation and start identifying with their tribe, their state, their party, their social group, or whatever. This is exactly when states began more aggressively pushing back against federal mandates, while simultaneously becoming more dependent on federal bailouts and stimulus. It's not the Constitution changed. It's the neural handshake between citizens, that unspoken agreement that we are all on the same team or on the same side. Well, that's kind of timed out, if you will. It just doesn't seem like we believe in that anymore. Recently, I noticed as I was just starting to put this podcast together, I got an email and there was an article in there on Justice Clarence Roberts. He recently gave a commencement speech at one of the Texas universities, referred to as his Celebrate America 250 address. I'd like to address some of the key points of his speech because it ties into this directly. The core of Thomas's argument is that the united part of the United States was originally built on the shared belief in natural rights. The idea that rights came from God or from nature or somewhere and are inherent to the individual, not granted to the government. He argues that since the early 20th century, a progressive view has taken hold which suggests rights are granted by the government and managed by so-called experts. He claims these two views, the natural rights versus government-granted rights, cannot coexist forever. And that's at the crux of our issues in America, and I believe he's onto the right track here. He links historical failures like the Plessy versus Ferguson conflict, which involved segregation, not to a failure of the Constitution itself, but to a lack of courage by leaders to stand by its original principles. He shared some stories of his grandfather in Georgia, noting that in a rural life, if you don't follow the proper process, like closing the gates, planting crops on time, doing those kind of things, the system fails. He views the Constitution the same way. If the process is ignored for the sake of convenience, the whole crop fails. And under the constitutional analogy, that would mean liberty fails. He implores people not to be passive spectators or cynics. He argues that if the citizens don't take ownership of the country, they are essentially handing control of their own thoughts and lives over to somebody else. I want to read a part of this. There was something in there that I found extremely, extremely interesting. In the second paragraph of the Declaration, it proclaims, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." He says, "Throughout my youth, these truths were articles of faith that were impervious to bigotry and discrimination." Thomas said that despite the multiplicity of laws and customs that reeked of bigotry, it was universally believed among those blacks with whom I lived, and whom had very little or no formal education, that in God's eyes and under our Constitution we were equal. At home, at school, and at church, we were taught that we are inherently equal, that equality came from God, and that it could not be diminished by man. So, I mean, when you think about it, because we have this republic, there's kind of a glue here that has kind of held us together. But my observation that we have 350 or 400 million people who no longer share a national identity, that aligns with his description or his information in this article. The glue is failing. It's not holding this together anymore. And that was his warning. If a group of people no longer agrees on the same source of their rights, God and nature versus government, they are no longer a union. They are just a crowd of people sharing a geographic space. So my question to you is that where we are? We are no longer a union. We are just people sharing geography. I kind of fear that's true. I hope it's not. When the federal government is seen as the provider of rights and benefits rather than the protector of inherent rights, the relationship becomes transactional. States want the benefits, the money and the services, but they reject the oversight because they no longer respect the underlying authority. This is how you get to the barely held together model that I mentioned as the title of this podcast. The neural handshake we talked about a minute ago. I mentioned that. Thomas's speech suggests that this handshake was originally based on a shared way of life, rooted in the Declaration of Independence. And without that shared root, the handshake times out, and we default to the cynicism and animus that he described. And you can see that in our everyday life, I believe. And here's what I call the donkey wrench. You're going to laugh at this. Recently, I did another article that I was writing, and my typing skills are not great at times. And I meant monkey wrench, throw a wrench in the works, the monkey wrench thing. It came out donkey wrench, and I didn't catch it. But I started reading that later, and I was going to maybe go back and change it. But I was referring to some of our people in government and sort of kind of referred to them as jackasses. And so as I thought about it, donkey wrench is pretty much appropriate. I mean, whether it's a monkey or a donkey, different animal, the same idea, right? So anyway, let's move on. Now, I just found that kind of funny when I seen that donkey wrench instead of monkey wrench. Your conclusion might be that the United States is becoming the associated states, or these barely held together states, because we have traded convenience, a permanent commitment to shared principles. We traded that for a contract a temporary agreement of mutual benefit. When the contract no longer feels like a good deal, the parties just stop following the rules. So let's shift our focus here for just a minute. States seem to want more autonomy these days, and little to no federal oversight. Some have even suggested that they might want to break away from the U.S., form their own little groups or own individual states. I just thought it might be interesting to take a look and see just exactly how dangerous and complicated that might be, even though some seem to think it's no big deal. But this thought cuts right to the mechanical reality of the Union. If you think of the United States as a machine, the federal government is no longer just the operator. It's become the fuel source for most of the parts. While we often think of federal workers as people in D.C., the reality is that the vast majority live in states. There are roughly 2.8 million civilian federal employees, or there was. I'm not sure the current figure exactly. And then there's also about 1.3 million active duty military. So in most states, federal jobs actually make up a reasonably small percentage of the total workforce, usually about 3%, but they're highly concentrated. And there's a multiplying effect. For every $1 million in federal spending, researchers estimate that it supports 10 to 30 local jobs. This means that even if you're only 2% of the people work for the feds, a massive chunk of the local economy, the dry cleaners, the grocery stores, the contractors, etc., they exist solely to serve those federal functions. So the barely held together theory, that's backed up by how many states rely on federal payout. We can categorize states into those who pay the bills and those who receive the benefits. Now we have some states, like Alaska, Kentucky, West Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, those are highly, highly dependent on federal money. It's, as far as from federal employees, military bases, whatever. We have on the other side of the scale, we have New Jersey, Massachusetts, Delaware, my home state, Utah, and California. They're somewhat less dependent. There was a special note here I noticed in Utah is actually one of the most economically independent states of the Union right now, ranked 47th. This suggests while Utah wants the benefits, it actually has a much stronger internal engine than many of its neighbors. That means we have a pretty good, strong economy, if you want to look at it like that. If the associated states, or these barely held together states, actually become independent entities today, only a handful would have the engine to survive a total break. And this is just based on the federal government employment. Okay, so we have California. They have a GDP that would rank the fifth largest in the world. They have high tech, they have agriculture, they have ports. So they could be a superpower on their own. Just focusing on just this one issue, though. I read an article just a few minutes ago before I started recording this where California, because of their environmental policies, have ran out their refineries to the point now they are begging the federal government to help them out with their gasoline because they no longer have the refineries enough to process the gasoline that they need. I find that kind of ironic, wouldn't you? And then we have Texas, of course. Their energy independence and their huge population gives them the potential of doing that. And then we have Washington and New York. These are only a few that could even have a chance of surviving on their own if they decide to break away. For a state like West Virginia or Mississippi, the federal government provides 40 to 45% of the state revenue. If the federal jurisdiction vanished, the economy of those states would collapse within a few months, I would think. Can 350 million individuals function in a meaningful way? That's a real good question, because that's kind of where we seem to be in today's world. We are not together near as much as we should. This is the core of the podcasts here, the call to action, if you will. Historically, when a republic hits this level of atomization, as we talked about earlier, everyone living on their own island, if you will, one of two things happens. Because the 350 million people can't agree on anything, a massive permanent bureaucracy, these so-called experts we talked about, and that's the ones that Clarence Thomas mentioned, they take over the steering wheel, right? People still live here, but they no longer govern. And then we have this realignment, if you will. A crisis, like economic or external, forces the islands to bridge back together, or it shatters the machine entirely. See, if we have a war, if we have some kind of a natural disaster, other things, can we get back together and can we fix it like we've always done in the past? If we look at the United States not as a political entity, but as a holding company, the federal government has effectively bought a majority stake in every state's survival. When you add these programs, the associated states look less like independent partners and more like subsidiaries. But now let's add another wrinkle to this here. Remember a minute ago we talked about states who could possibly break away and have enough of an economy to survive? But that was only regarding federal employees and federal money going in that way. But if we take and look at the Medicaid and the Medicare and those other things, like all of these grants and federal programs that go out to the states, this is where the big donkey wrench hits the fan. For state budgets, on average, Medicaid alone makes up 30% of state funding. The federal government pays for roughly 65% of that. And then, of course, we have that multiplier effect again. For every $1 million in federal health care spending, it sorts between 10 and 30 local jobs. That includes nurses, pharmacists, and even construction workers and buildings and stuff like that. When you add Social Security and Medicare money that bypasses the state government, goes straight into the local economy, federal spending accounts for nearly 20% to 25% of the total GDP in some states. Okay, so when you think about the autonomy question of the state, who could actually function? If we cut the cord today, the associated states would face an immediate humanitarian and economic cliff. Most states are constitutionally required to have a balanced budget. If federal funding for Medicaid which is roughly $600 billion nationally, if that vanished, states would have to double their state income tax overnight or stop providing health care to 1 in 5 residents. Utah is one of the strongest autonomous candidates because of its diversified economy, the tech, business, tourism, mining, all kinds of things, oil. However, even Utah receives roughly $4,000 to $5,000 per resident in federal funding annually. Without that, the state's neural handshake with the citizens, if you will, the promise of roads and schools and safety, it would likely break. So the question comes back again, can 350 million people function meaningfully without a common cause or without a common ideal? We are socially atomized today, divided politics, identity, but economically we're integrated still, tied to the same federal checkbook. This creates a high level of cynicism. People feel like they don't have a voice because the machine, the federal programs, keep running regardless of who they vote for locally. Individuals living here are no longer a public, right? They're just a group that there, and we don't decide anything. We're just kind of a clientele. We just receive services. We used to say, the united we stand, right, as a promise of loyalty. Today it's becoming a warning of liability. We aren't held together by the firm league of friendship the founders envisioned. We're held together by a federal checkbook that neither the states nor the citizens can walk away from. We've kind of traded our common identity for a common debt, if you will. And the United States has become a collection of 350 million islands, all waiting for the same tide to come in. There's an old saying, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. I think we should be careful today what we wish for. We have a lot of, like I said, we have states that they no longer want federal oversight. They want to break away. They want autonomy. But that's going to come at a tremendous cost. And that's the whole point of this podcast. I'm going to leave it there today. I think that's more than enough. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you found it entertaining, educational, or thought-provoking. Join me next time, won't you? I'm Craig Warren, and this has been Ramblings of an Old Fart podcast. God bless and keep you. Till next time.